Today's topic, we're going to be discussing unconscious bias, diversity and inclusion. My name is Ellen Kinsella. You might recognise my voice from our other 30-minute complimentary webinar that we have on offer at the moment on health anxiety. I'm just going to start by going over today's topics that we'll be discussing in our agenda. It's going to be broken up into 3 different elements. So we're going to be looking at bias, the types of biases that there are. We're going to be looking at it in the context of the coronavirus and the stigma that a lot of people are experiencing at the moment due to the coronavirus outbreak. We're going to also be looking at how we manage that particular kind of stigma and key factors to managing your unconscious bias. Then we're going to be looking at diversity and looking at what is diversity. We're going to be looking at diversity and comparing it with inclusion. And the way we're going to do that is be describing it as diversity as the what and inclusion as the how. And that will make more sense as we go further along presentations today. Finally, we're going to be looking at inclusion and building a more inclusive working environment. We're going to be looking at inclusion as it's defined. What is inclusion? We're going to be looking at the fundamentals of inclusion and also the latest research that's available with regards to diversity and inclusion that is put forward by the Australian Diversity Council, which is a fantastic resource that I would encourage you all to have a look at if you are interested in this topic. So firstly, let's have a look at some common biases that people may experience or be subject to. The first one is attribution bias. This is where we recall information as though it was never there. We just assumed that it was. So we recall it as though it was there, even though it was never there. We assume that it was there. Aversive racism is racial biases that result in negative evaluations or racial ethnic minorities by persistent avoidance of interaction with other racial or ethnic groups. So this is being aversive or avoidant to certain members of certain ethnic or cultural groups. We have blatant biases. These are the conscious beliefs that we have that we're aware of. So these are our feelings and behaviours that we're perfectly willing to admit to. Discrimination. Discrimination is the behaviour. So it's the behaviour that advantages or disadvantages people merely based on the group with which they identify, their group membership. Prejudice. Prejudice is similar to discrimination. However, it's the evaluation and the emotional side of things that we experience or may experience towards people merely based on their group membership. Similarity bias. This is when we prefer to be around people who are similar to ourselves. And we see this demonstrated in the workplace, for example, when people hire others who they believe to be similar to themselves. Social identity theory. This is the tendency for people to categorize each of the groups and favoring their own. We have a stereotype threat. This is when stereotyped groups start to believe their own stereotypes. So for example, there we've got when girls start to believe that they're bad at maths because of the stereotype that girls and females are bad at maths. We also see this in things like women are bad drivers or phrases like, man up and, men don't cry and things like that. When people start to really believe and embody these stereotypes and it starts to impact their belief system and also their behaviour. We have the anchoring effect. This is the first impression of a person when it gets anchored in your mind, and as a result, it can be very difficult to change your mind about a person, even when contradicting information is revealed. So even when things that support and provide evidence for that anchoring to not be true, it's very difficult for people to change their mind once they have that anchoring effect. We also have the halo effect. This is an overall impression of a person who influences our perception of what we think about them. So you might see this in a person with a job. He reminds me of myself when I was that age, so he's going to do a great job. this is a halo effect. That person has placed a halo on that person. We've also seen some research with people giving jobs to people that they deem to be likable or attractive over people that they do not. We've seen studies that have shown prison sentences given to people that vary for people that they deem to have this halo effect. So these are some interesting social phenomenon that we see when we look specifically at the kinds of biases that there are all around us every day, some of which we might identify as either having exhibited or experienced, some of them maybe not. So now we've got a bit of an understanding about what unconscious bias is and the kinds of biases that there are. I'm going to hone in specifically with how this relates in the context to the coronavirus and the stigma that some people have experienced as a result of this current health emergency that is ongoing at the moment. Oops, sorry, I've skipped ahead. So people might experience stigma as a result of their country of origin or maybe even their profession. We've seen a lot of stigmatization against groups who come from different countries, specifically Iran, from China and Italy, areas where the coronavirus has been particularly and very unfortunately very prevalent. The groups who are from these areas or have travelled to these areas, we're noticing an increase in stigmatization towards those individuals. We've also seen stigmatization against people who have travelled, who travel for work or are quite avid travellers just in general. We also are now starting to see it with our healthcare professionals and first responders. People are avoiding and stigmatizing these groups of people because they associate the coronavirus to these people as a result of their nationality, as a result of their travel habits or their occupation. It's important to note that stigma is very hurtful for the people that experience it. It creates a lot of anger between people. It can result in social avoidance and rejection, denial of healthcare, education, housing, and employment. It can also lead to a higher vulnerability of physical violence. So just keeping in mind how this stigmatization can really can grow quite quickly, and it becomes much, much worse when we don't call it out, when we don't notice it, when we don't have this level of awareness that it's going on. The perfect example of this stigma that we're seeing around the coronavirus, particularly how it impacts people from Asian descendants. We've got the President Trump at the moment tweeting the coronavirus, calling it the China virus repeatedly over and over again on Twitter. And we can see how the use of this phrase and this spread of misinformation kind of perpetuates that idea of stigmatization against certain groups and association of the coronavirus to certain groups. So how can we reduce the level of stigma that we're seeing? We can maintain the privacy and confidentiality of those seeking treatment or testing. We can raise awareness without increasing fear. We do this by sharing accurate information about how the virus spreads. So avoiding salacious media, making sure that we are speaking facts and speaking truths and not spreading panic and misinformation. Speaking out against negative behaviours, including negative statements on social media like Donald Trump, as we've just mentioned, against certain groups of people or exclusions of people who pose no risk to regular activities. Be cautious about the images that you're sharing and things that you're sharing on your social platforms, making sure that they don't reinforce any stereotypes. And particularly with the prevalence of social media as it is in this day and age, being very, very cautious of that. Engage with stigmatized groups in person and through media channels. Obviously, at the moment, we are trying our best to contain the virus here in Australia and doing so through social distancing and practicing isolation where it's required. So sometimes person-to-person engagement may not be suitable, but I strongly would recommend still reaching out through media channels, through telephone, text, email, call, whatever works for you. Thanking your healthcare workers and first responders as opposed to, treating them with stigma, as we've just mentioned. They're highly vulnerable to stigmatisation. So taking the time to thank them for their efforts and to keep us all safe and well. And share the need for social support for people who have returned from overseas or worried about friends and relatives in affected regions. So doing what we can to make sure that we're looking after one another, particularly for those who have concerns about their friends and relatives. So moving on now, why is unconscious bias such a problem at work? It prevents diversity and inclusion as we favour people who are more like us. It prevents the equality for everybody. It starts having the same ideas perpetually over and over again, the same old ideas and solutions for a team where everyone is too similar. We don't get any creativity. We don't get any new ways of doing things, new thoughts, and new levels of expertise and the wisdom that comes when we incorporate an open mind and we're not being unconsciously biased. And remember, without that familiarity, we go back into an amygdala or limbic hijack. And I'll just take a moment to explain this fourth square there. Generally speaking, our brain is designed to be unconsciously biased from an evolutionary perspective. As humans developed, our amygdala, a very significant and active part of our brain when we're talking about unconscious bias, it looks for similarities in others. And the reason it does that is because we want to be safe. We want to be around things that are familiar to us. We want to be around things that are similar to us, things and people that are familiar and that we can relate to. And when we're no longer surrounded by that sense of security and familiarity, we can go into what's called the limbic hijack, where we start to panic and start to treat things as a threat, and we keep an eye out for the next threat that's going to be coming, and we go into this heightened state of awareness. So without familiarity, we do tend to go into this limbic hijack. So when we're looking at unconscious bias, that's why it's so important to be aware of it and to put things in place so that we are no longer having this us and them, this othering kind of mentality, whereas we're facing and leaning in towards more inclusivity to avoid having that limbic response. Some key factors in managing unconscious bias. We're going to go through these one by one. So awareness and slowing down. What's your language? Find evidence against stereotypes. Encourage diversity at work and also in your social life. And the practical application. So firstly, awareness and slowing down. We want you to slow down and have awareness of your biases. As I said, it is a natural phenomenon. We have this propensity to look for things that are familiar and look for familiarity and security in people around us. But the first step is having that level of awareness. Once you're aware of our unconscious bias, and it's perfectly normal, we have more of an ability to catch ourselves out and put strategies in place to not lean into those unconscious biases. What's your language? So being conscious of the words that we choose to say, they might be quite habitual to us, but by being mindful of the words we choose is a way in which we can break that cycle. So gender stereotypes are common, and what gender stereotypes are alive and well in our community. So things like saying, "Hi guys," instead of, "Good morning, afternoon, team, everyone." Even the dictionary denotes nagging. The term nagging is something that women do. It's a very gendered stereotype. Where do you use language that facilitates unconscious bias? And more importantly, how can you change it? I would challenge you to maybe have a think about it next time you notice yourself using terminology that you could be using other ways that are more gender neutral and not leaning into those gender stereotypes. Some examples I have here might be policeman instead of a police officer, cameraman instead of a camera operator. And not only with gender stereotypes, but choosing language that's appropriate for other groups and particularly other vulnerable groups, like people living with a disability. Rather than saying a disabled person, try using terminology like people living with a disability or a schizophrenic, somebody living with schizophrenia. There's very, very subtle changes we can make, but they're very, very powerful in breaking down these stereotypes that are perpetuated through our everyday language. So what's your language? Finding evidence against stereotypes. So having images clearly displayed around the workplace that display diversity and go against stereotypes. So increasing people's exposure to stereotypes that go against the norm enables people to reduce their amygdala hijack, as it's no longer an unusual stimuli to them. So by exposing ourselves over a period of time and continuously doing that exposure, we're likely to see something more as a familiarity and start to feel secure, as opposed to the opposite of that, where it's unfamiliar to us and where our brain might deem it to be a threat in that amygdala hijack. And of course, maybe we're not consciously thinking that, but just at a very neurobiological level, just having that level of exposure to things that go against stereotypes is very, very powerful. Now we're going to go on to my favorite topic, which is diversity. And we're going to talk about diversity within your workplace and why it's so important. And we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some some new statistics that are available to us around diversity in the workplace, and why it's so important, where it's going, and the status quo of what we can see in Australia at the moment. So we want to encourage diversity. A diverse and inclusive workplace matters to your organisation. This has been found to increase adaptability, improve customer service, and drive innovation and business growth. How diverse is your team? Acknowledge the diversity of your team members and what they have brought to this team. What is it that they've brought that's different? What have they brought that's different to something that maybe you have brought into the team? What is diversity? As I said before, we're going to think about diversity as the what and inclusion as the how. So think of diversity as the presence of variety or differences amongst employees. The differences in people in how they identify in relation to their social and professional identity. Now, it's very important that we distinguish between social and professional identity, because people will have differentiators between how they identify socially and how they identify professionally. And we need to ensure that we're embracing both of these. So you can see on the slide there's some green circles and orange circles. The green circles represent our social identity. So that's our gender, our age, our abilities, our faith, our cultural background, our sexual preference, socioeconomic status, Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander background, and your caring responsibilities as well, whether you're a mother, whether you look after young children, whether you look after your elderly parents. These are your social identifiers and how you identify. Then we have the orange circles, which is your professional identity. So this is your experience level that you have, the profession that you have, the title you hold within your organisation, the level within your organisation where you sit, and your education history. All of these things blend together into our identity. And then this identity becomes your perspective, how you see yourself and how others see you. And it's so important that we embrace all of these different variations, what makes us different, but also what makes us the same. Now we're going to have a little bit of a look at the what and the how. So diversity and inclusion, as I said, thinking of diversity as the what. This is the presence of individuals within a group or organisation from multiple backgrounds, ages, genders, sexualities, religions, etc. Inclusion is how. So this is the consequences of how we utilise this within our workplace. So the varying strengths, the varying expertise, the wisdom of these individuals within a group or organisation, how we're going to use and lean into those differences to strengthen our workplace culture, to generate, great new ideas, creativity, and to create a more adaptive workplace to engage in the ever-changing world. The world is changing every single day. So our ability to be more inclusive should reflect that. We need to be able to have a broader range of individuals from all different backgrounds in our workplace. We need to be embracing of this so that we can achieve the best possible outcomes. We're going to have a little bit of a look at inclusion now. As I said, think of inclusion as the how. So all of these brilliant things that make up diversity, inclusion is how we're going to implement that into our workplace and what happens as a result of that implementation. So inclusion occurs when diversity happens and when people are respected, connected, and progressing and contributing to their organisation and the organisation's success. So it's basically all of these elements that define us in action and how we embrace those. So I'm just going to break down each of these 4 areas of the circle here. So diversity and inclusion occurs when people are respected. So inclusion occurs when diversity of people work and feel valued and respected for who they are. Connection. So when people feel connected. Inclusion occurs when a diversity of people feel connected to their co-workers. So they have a sense of belonging. Progressing. So progressing. Inclusion occurs when a diversity of people at work have opportunities that develop their career and progress their career. And contributing. Inclusion occurs when a diversity of people can contribute and feel that their talents and their energies go towards energizing the organisation. We're going to go through a couple of very, very interesting statistics that are available, as I said, from the Diversity Council of Australia. Now, the DCA has produced some really interesting research that was developed in conjunction with Suncorp and Novartis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They started what was called the Inclusion at Work Survey. Now, they've been running the survey for a number of years, but I just want to draw the attention firstly to the survey that was conducted between 2019 and 2020. So in the participants, essentially the survey had a representative sample of about 3,000 Australian workers. And the survey is repeated biannually to map and track the inclusion or lack of inclusion in the Australian workforce over time. So there's a variety of ages, there's a variety of genders, sexuality, physical abilities, nationalities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So we've got a whole blend of people that make up a representative sample of Australian workers. The goal was to encourage the Australian organisations to achieve inclusion in their workplaces. And as I said, because they're going to track it biannually, we can see how that either improves or it goes down and reduces in the level of inclusivity. I'm going to go through the findings, which were very, very interesting, particularly, as I said, between 2019 and 2020. The survey revealed a growth in strong support for workplace inclusion when they compared it to the results of the 2017-2018 index. So this was the most notable of any changes between the two surveys. So that was people's support for inclusivity in the workplace. This year's index also found that inclusion at work continues to matter to the majority of Australian workers. They believe it benefits everybody, not just people from targeted community groups. It boosts employee performance and employee well-being. So this is the general consensus that we're seeing coming out of this survey. Having said that, though, despite this, some employees have noted that they experienced notably lower levels of inclusion and higher levels of exclusion than their colleagues did. And honing in specifically on employees who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, also individuals living with a disability, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex or queer workers, so the LGBTIQ community within the workplace. So unfortunately, these groups of individuals felt that they experienced notably lesser levels of inclusion when we compared them with their colleagues. Inclusion at work is still good for all employees. So as I said, not just targeted groups, but for everybody. It's such an important concept that we start to incorporate inclusivity and diversity into our workplace. Just looking at some of the stats here that was found, you can see here the orange represents workers in a non-inclusive organisational culture, and that grey colour represents workers who do identify as working in an inclusive organisational culture. They found that they were 5 times more likely to be really satisfied with their job than workers who identified as not working in an inclusive team, twice as likely to receive regular career development opportunities, twice as likely to have been given constructive performance feedback, and 3 times more likely to leave their current employer if they were not, 3 times less likely to leave their current employer when they were in groups that they felt they were in an inclusive organisation, as opposed to the people who identified as not being a part of an inclusive organisation. So some pretty powerful statistics there. You can see how job satisfaction and retention rates and your ability to progress in your career and your performance feedback all becomes impacted simply by having an inclusive workplace. So very interesting statistics there. I'd very much encourage you to have a look at the Diversity Council of Australia, because this entire inclusivity survey that they did, there's many, many more statistics like this that are very, very interesting to consider. So now we're going to finish up on how you can make your workplace more inclusive. You can connect. You can create a safe working environment where employees feel that they are welcome and it's open to get to know one another. You can lead by example, by spreading the word that discrimination and/or exclusion is simply not tolerated in your workplace. And you can play a major role in changing the status quo when you lead by example. Again, minding your language. So making sure that you're making those simple changes that we discussed before, or at least being aware of when we're using language that could be, you can use better terminology. So using the word partner instead of husband or wife, and making assumptions about people's partners. And as I said, some of those really subtle nuances you can change between maybe using words like, hey guys, and instead of saying, hi everyone. Make a space. So holding office functions where accessibility is not an issue and employees of all physical abilities are able to access. And keeping in mind also dietary requirements as a result of people's religious considerations, being very respectful when we're holding group meetings or group celebrations. Simply just having that level of awareness is a way we can show respect for our co-workers and demonstrate that we are an inclusive workplace. As I said, this is a 30-minute condensed version of our presentation today, so it's very high level. We do go into far more detail in our 1-hour version of this presentation, so I would encourage you to reach out to your customer relationship managers or our performance services team if you would like to know more. But that's it from me today. Thank you so much for your attendance, everyone. I hope that it was an informative presentation, and I look forward to seeing and speaking with you all in the near future. Thank you so much. Take care.